I'm afraid I didn't ask my mother enough questions about her work at the Bauhaus. Most of what I know I learned from letters and diaries that I read after her death. When we talked about her past, it was mostly about her youth in Munich and her experiences as a voluntary Red Cross nurse in the First World War. I know now that the terrible last months at the Bauhaus were the main reason why she didn't talk much about her years at the Bauhaus Dessau. Even when old Bauhaus friends stayed with us, it was mostly Bauhaus Weimar they talked about. I am Monika Stadler, the younger daughter of Gunta Stölzl.
Well, the funny thing really is that I had never heard about Gunta Stölzl when I met her daughter, Monika, and I was doing my master's in Groningen in art history, and I was really looking for something to do. I met Monika Stadler, who had reached out to the university and to the museum in Groningen because she was looking for someone who could help her in managing the estate of her mother. Well, that student became me. My name is Mirjam Deckers, and I am an art historian from the Netherlands.
My name is Anja Guttenberger, and this is my podcast, Bauhaus Faces. Welcome to a new episode of Bauhaus Faces. I'm Anja, your host. This episode is dedicated to the Bauhaus master Gunta Stölzl, one of the few better-known Bauhaus women. We have already mentioned her name in the previous podcast episode about Stölzl's first husband, the Israeli architect Arieh Sharon. They had a daughter, Yael, that was born in 1929. Do you remember? And Ariel Aloni, my interview partner for that episode, is also Gunta Stölzl's grandson. My interview partners for today's episode are Gunta Stölzl's younger daughter, Monika Stadler, and the Dutch art historian Mirjam Deckers. As we have already two people talking in this podcast, you will hear not much of me. My own research into Gunta Stölzl's life and work is rather restricted, and I will therefore leave the talking to the expert and the daughter as they talk about Gunta Stölzl's life and work in Munich, before the Bauhaus, as a student at the Bauhaus in Weimar, as a master of the weaving workshop at the Bauhaus in Dessau, and with her own businesses in Switzerland after the Bauhaus. So enjoy now a new episode of Bauhaus Faces, and let's dive into our new episode and shine a spotlight on Gunta Stölzl, a female master among all the males.
So Gunta Stölzl was born in 1897 in Munich, and she grew up there as the daughter of a school principal. And her father was really well acquainted with the pedagogue Kerschensteiner. And Kerschensteiner really was a kind of reform pedagogue who advocated that children should be kind of learning by doing. And I think that was really important for Gunta Stölzl at a young age as well. And in 1914, she entered the local Kunstgewerbeschule in Munich, where she studied under director Richard Riemerschmidt, who is also a very well-known artist in the circles of the German Werkbund, and who also had these reform ideas concerning education and how art and the applied arts should be taught. And he was really trying to implement in Munich an education at the Kunstgewerbeschule that was focusing much more on workshop education. So really the idea of the Werkstatt. And he was really kind of criticized for it in the end as well. But I think that for Gunta Stölzl, this was really important. And we think that she studied glass painting, ceramics, mainly art history at the Kunstgewerbeschule. But at that time, you didn't really choose one specific craft that you would specialize in at the Kunstgewerbeschule. So it's also kind of a bit vague what she did at the Kunstgewerbeschule in Munich, because she thought it was too old-fashioned in the end, her education. So she decided actually to throw most of her school assignments from those years away. And of course, these are also the years that coincide with the First World War in Germany in particular. And that also caused most of the archives from the Kunstgewerbeschule from those years to be kind of lacking, to be missing. So it's really difficult to get a grasp on what Gunta Stölzl did before she went to the Bauhaus. She herself interrupted her studies at the Kunstgewerbeschule in 1917 to serve as a nurse at the Red Cross. So she traveled to the Eastern Front and to the Western Front in Flanders, in France, for example, to help, to serve and to take care of soldiers. But she also really witnessed firsthand the horrors of the First World War. And when she returned to Munich, when the war had ended, she was kind of disillusioned and she was really looking for something new. She was also doubting whether she would have to finish her studies in Munich. So at some point in April 1919, when Walter Gropius published his Bauhaus manifesto, she must have read it, probably in Richard Riemerschmidt's office. And she decided, I'm not going to finish my studies. She only had several months to go, but she decided, no, I'm going to pack my bags and I'm going to Weimar. And so that's what she did. She was one of the first students in Weimar in the autumn of 1919. And in Weimar, she was really struck by the sense of community. So this student community, but also the kind of informal relationships between teachers and students. So she, for example, really admired Gropius and Johannes Itten in particular. So she followed courses with Itten, and then she decided to do some glass painting in Weimar and also to do some decorative painting. But in her own words, this was really too strenuous. So these were activities that were very hard on the body and that were very much also focused on renovating the school buildings in Weimar, the former buildings of the Van der Velde Kunstgewerbeschule. So at some point she decided, this is not what I want to do. And there is not really something at the Bauhaus being offered that suits me. And that's when she discovered the already existing textile department of Helene Berner, who had already been a teacher at the Kunstgewerbeschule with Henri van der Velde. And she kind of discovered, in her own words, the looms there and the weaving looms. And then she decided, well, maybe this is what I want to do. We think that she also had some experience with textiles, weaving, maybe some embroidery at the Kunstgewerbeschule in Munich, but we are not sure.
What I know about my mother's time at the Bauhaus, I know for a great deal because my sister and I read documents after our mother's death. Notebooks from her years in Munich, the diary she kept when she served as a Red Cross nurse in the field hospitals during World War I, and the diary of her first year at the Bauhaus, and also correspondences. Parts of the diaries have been quoted a lot. Those about the lessons of Johannes Itten, the leadership of Walter Gropius, the struggles between liberal and less liberal students, and of course the struggles of the women for equal chances. Since all the recent films and publications in 2019, the world knows all about that struggle. Gunta Stölzl had great expectations when she came to the Bauhaus. She didn't come to learn weaving. She also hoped for art. First, she tried glass painting. She had done that already in Munich. But the teacher in the city of Weimar was not good. Her next choice then was wall painting. In her diary, she wrote that she saw wall painting as a useful craft. But she added, if I become good enough, I can also paint murals. You see, she was still hoping for art. She was, of course, thinking of the sort of murals that Oskar Schlemmer painted in the Bauhaus building in Weimar. The problem was again the master of craft. He made her work so hard that in the evening she couldn't hold a pencil in her hand to do her homework for the course of Johannes Itten. Of course, this master of wall painting simply did not want girls in his class. Physical strength was not the problem with her. My mother was physically as strong as a man. Actually, I think this Bauhaus diary and also the war diary should be published sometime. They are a good read and they reveal a lot. And they could be beautifully illustrated by works that sometimes are dated exactly on the same day as the diary entries.
From earlier years, we know that she was inspired a lot by the artists that were operating in Munich, in the Blaue Reiter, for example. So she was a huge admirer of Franz Marc, for example, August Macke. We know that they really influenced also her feeling of color. She had an interesting color palette already in earlier years, where she kept most of her drawings and watercolors from her early years in Munich. So things that she created outside of the school walls. And you really see there, and I think that is something that you also see in her Bauhaus work, that she really had an interesting color palette where she would use contrasting colors that were also used by the artists of the Blaue Reiter, for example. That was really something that she was looking at. And she also had a deep love for particularly Gothic art from the Middle Ages. She would go to the museums in Munich, for example, to see these pieces. And of course, as most German artists from that generation, she was hugely inspired by the letters of Vincent van Gogh that were published already quite early in Germany. Gunta Stölzl got it for Christmas, I think in 1915 or something. And she was reading these letters, and that really inspired her also to aspire for an artistic career. And I think that the influence of Van Gogh and the Blaue Reiter were kind of lasting also throughout the Bauhaus years. I think that the question of influence is always difficult in art history, of course, but I think that, for example, the abstract paintings of Paul Klee, whom Stölzl really admired, were a source of inspiration. Paul Klee would also teach a special design course for the weavers in Dessau. But I think that it has been written often that the Bauhaus weavers were kind of influenced by, the abstract paintings of, for example, a Paul Klee, a Wassily Kandinsky at the Bauhaus. But I think it's good to mention that this was not a kind of a one-way influence. I think that Paul Klee was very much inspired as well by the weaves of weavers such as Gunta Stölzl, and that this abstract language of form was something that the weavers recognized from their practice being always related to strictly horizontal and vertical lines.
Weimar was what she called the primordial soup of the Bauhaus, der Urschlamm vom Bauhaus, when lots of things could still be figured out, and it seems her talents were recognized by the masters. You must know that she had decided to quit her education at her arts and crafts school in Munich to go to the totally new Bauhaus. Her school in Munich was a reasonably modern school led by the now still famous Richard Riemersmith. She left it only a few months before her graduation. Not that she feared her exams. On the contrary, she was a good student, and upon returning from the war, she had taken part in a commission that made plans for modernizing the school problem. There she saw a flyer of the Bauhaus and realized that the things they were only planning for her arts and crafts school were already realized at this Bauhaus. So she took the train to Weimar and showed Gropius some of her works, and he accepted her immediately as a student. But imagine, she left that school in Munich only a few months before her graduation. I wonder what her parents had to say about this, in times of extreme poverty after the war. But her father was a wise man. He trusted his daughter and recognized her talents. Imagine, her parents sent not only money, but also food when she was at the Bauhaus. After her first year, Gropius asked her to take on some responsibility in what was at that time called women's class. She would not have to pay school money then. When Gropius asked her to take this job, she had actually wanted to leave the Bauhaus. She was so heartbroken when her engagement with the Bauhaus painter Walter Gillies had come to an end. She really planned to leave. Maybe Gropius knew this. There is an entry in her diary which says that he chained her to the Bauhaus by offering her this job.
So in the summer of 1920, after taking her first year at the Bauhaus, she started weaving. And she started with tapestry weaving, so kind of creating very beautiful wall hangings. And that slowly evolved into the textile department, the weaving department that the Bauhaus is now famous for. Her first main project was Kühe in Landschaft. So that's her first wall hanging created in the summer of 1920. And it's a relatively small wall hanging. And it's really interesting to see how many types of wool she used in this wall hanging and how many colors are in this wall hanging and how she tried to kind of explore the use of kind of expressionist colors in a almost abstract landscape that represents cows in her beloved mountains. Also, she loved the mountains. And I think that it's interesting also to place this wall hanging in the context of the material scarcity that was going on in those post-war years. And we also know that from the Bauhaus in Weimar, it was constantly struggling with a lack of materials. And the students in this textile department would ask the inhabitants, the local inhabitants of Weimar, do you have any scraps of fabrics left for us to use? Because especially fabrics were really, really scarce during those years. And I think that the reason that Kühe in Landschaft has so many different colors is also a result of the fact that Gunta Stölzl simply had to get together any materials that she could lay her hands on in those years. So that's really one of her first key projects in Weimar. And then she created 2 chairs with Marcel Breuer, who was in the carpenter workshop. And those were really important collaborations also to show that fabrics really had this functional quality and that weaving could really be used to function within the interior. So they created first the African chair as it's known today, which is really also this kind of expressionist color palette in a really a very beautiful chair made out of wood, where Gunta Stölzl created the spanning fabrics on the chair. And then there is a few months later only, she created a second chair with Marcel Breuer, which really shows the influence of, for example, the Dutch art movement, the stijl, where you see red, yellow, and blue straps of wool interlaced on the chair. And those are really kind of the first collaborations where you see that fabrics could move into the interior. And then very important, I think, is Gunta Stölzl's so-called Gesellenstück that she created somewhere in late 1922. So after taking the basic course in textiles. And this was a rug that was knotted in the Smyrna technique. So Smyrna knots. And these knots, this technique was really used a lot in the Bauhaus weaving workshop throughout its years, creating rugs that are really interesting when you compare them to, well, the more traditional Oriental rugs, for example, where you have a clear border, a clear symmetry, often recognizable motifs from nature. That is not something that you see at the Bauhaus, and also something that you won't see in Gunta Stölzl's rugs. Those rugs at the Bauhaus were really interesting in the way that they would not be kind of self-contained entities with a clear border, with a clear center, but really rugs that seem to move into the interior beyond the borders of their planes.
In hindsight, she glorified the Weimar period compared to the Dessau period. You know, the weaving workshop in Weimar was soon successful. Its products were well liked. A proof of their popularity at the time is the fact that fabrics and wall hangings were already bought by museums. For example, Museum Die Neue Sammlung in Munich bought fabrics and wall hangings of hers from the Weimar period. By the way, some of these works in Munich can be seen in the exhibition in Kunstmuseum Thun, Switzerland, this year. The title of the exhibition is Gunta Stölzl and Johannes Itten, Textile Universes. My mother always remembered the freedom in the weaving department, figuring out new techniques, learning from each other, and in general, the optimistic atmosphere at the early Bauhaus, the fun, the imaginative parties. Dessau was different. Here she was officially responsible for the weaving department. Her workload was heavy. Before the new building was ready, she had to install all the weaving equipment in a provisional building without any heating. When all the looms were finally installed in the new Bauhaus building, in that wonderfully light big room, she wrote happy letters to her family and to her friend, the weaver Benita Otte. Otte had left the Bauhaus when it moved to Dessau. And my mother was happy also that she was now assisted by a fully trained weaving master, Walter Wanke. The workshop in Dessau was heading more and more towards training weavers to design for mechanical looms. So she wrote new study plans, which included also internships in weaving mills. The weaving workshop was still expected to create more income than the other departments. And the hope was now that contracts with mills producing Bauhaus designs would be profitable. I doubt whether she herself was able to gain experience at such a mill. I never heard her about it. But I remember visiting a mill in Switzerland with her and how we were both shocked about the horrible heat and noise in that room. Textile art was less and less expected of the weavers, and I remember that looking back, the weavers who visited us really regretted this. My mother, nevertheless, she herself went on designing wall hangings. Her lovely double weave designs are clearly meant for wall hangings, and she simply made her big and intricate wall hanging called Red Green on Sunday in her free time, she told me. I've been wondering for many years now that her designs for wall hangings executed in jacquard technique have been given so little attention. Most are in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and not in one of the 3 Bauhaus museums. That might be the reason. She mostly used the jacquard technique for wall hangings. Jacquard is suitable for producing relatively quickly hundreds of meters of one fabric. But she seems to have used the technique above all for wall hangings, in other words, for textile art. I guess she had realized that the preliminary work of punching jacquard cards for her geometrical designs was not so very much work, at least much less work than if she had pre-programmed the reproduction of a realistic painting with 1,000 more holes.
I think that when you look at how the weaving workshop developed in Dessau under Gunta Stölzl's guidance, what really stands out is how the workshop was further professionalized. When Helene Böhner left the Bauhaus, so she didn't come along to Dessau, most of the looms in Weimar had been her own private property. So that meant that the Bauhaus was suddenly lacking looms. So Gunta Stölzl was kind of asked to really reinstall the weaving workshop, which meant that she could opt for looms and tools that could really suit the program and the aims of the Bauhaus. So what you see is that there were a lot of looms, all hand weaving looms, by the way. So there were no machine looms. It was all hand weaving, because only through hand weaving, the weavers thought, you can really get to know the proper materials and the proper weave and the proper colors for the fabric that you are aiming to create a fabric that can really fulfill its function into the interior. So she really professionalized the workshop, that's for sure. And as a teacher, she would give courses in Bindungslehre, so the study of weaves, the different types of weaves, but also, for example, in how to calculate a fabric, how to calculate the different costs for a fabric, for example, or courses in how to design for the industry, for example. So these were all courses that would really prepare the students for a future in a profession in weaving, whether it would be hand weaving or weaving in collaboration with industry. And we know from her own writings, especially from the early years in Dessau, that her tasks as a Meister were a lot. So she had a lot of responsibilities, and she didn't have any time really to create much of her own work. But it's also good to mention that she wasn't operating on her own. She had a Webmeister, so a weaving master, Walter Wanke, who was appointed in the early years in Dessau to kind of assist Stölzl in her many, many tasks that she had as, well, the one who had to reorganize the workshop, who had to do the teaching, but also, well, the weaving workshop was very successful, was getting a lot of commissions from outside of the Bauhaus. And these commissions, well, they were often on a hard deadline. And to kind of assist Gunta Stölzl also in her teaching practices, Wanke was called to the Bauhaus as a weaving master who also knew the textile industry quite well and knew how to organize the curriculum in such a way that the industry could also be implemented. And I think that weaving is such a complicated and a broad craft with so many possibilities. It's very difficult to lead a weaving workshop all by yourself, having to teach students and having to collaborate on commissions and to, well, get connections with the industry, because that was something that the Bauhaus was really trying to do more in Dessau, get license contracts with the industry. And the textile department was quite successful in that, but there are also students, especially from the later years in Dessau, who have been criticizing Gunta Stölzl that especially this collaboration with the industry was not implemented perfectly, that was somewhat lacking also because the weaving workshop at the Bauhaus was always focused on hand weaving. So hand weaving was the principal core in education. And, well, the industry, I think that the Bauhaus and Gunta Stölzl as Meister in the weaving workshop, they were really revolutionary in trying to find a curriculum that could combine both hand weaving and working for the industry. And, I think the Bauhaus didn't exist long enough in the end to really, kind of perfectionize this in a way. So Gunta Stölzl was criticized for that, but I think that overall it's thanks to her that the Bauhaus weaving workshop was such a big success in Dessau. When Hannes Meyer came to Dessau, the pressure on the weaving workshop to produce was increasing, and Gunta Stölzl felt that as the leader of a workshop. And on the other hand, she was also very close to Hannes Meyer and also was interested in his ideas. So I think that she would have, she loved Walter Gropius, so she was really sad when he left. But Hannes Meyer for her was also kind of a breath of fresh air in a way, but also increased the pressure on her as Meister of the weaving workshop and on her production as well.
Her struggles at the Bauhaus concerned mainly her position as a master. First of all, her contract was not as good as that of her male colleagues. She earned at all times much less, and her contract was a lot more insecure. But she also protested. At one moment, she wrote 2 letters to the magistrate of Dessau. They are both dated 27th December 1926. We have her duplicates. The first letter goes, "Hereby I withdraw from my employment contract with the city of Dessau, effective 1st of April 1927. But she adds, I am willing to negotiate about the possibility of remaining at the Bauhaus under the fundamental condition that my position as head of the weaving department is legally acknowledged and assured through a long-term contractual relationship. In addition, I expect that the salary for this position will be equal to those received by the heads of the other departments." That was letter 1 she posted on 27th of December. In the second letter that landed on the desk of the magistrate on the same day, she regrets that she cannot agree to a reduction of her salary in connection with the financing of experimental work because her contract is much worse anyway than that of her colleagues. However, she adds, if her position should be satisfactorily regulated, she would join in this agreement made with her colleagues concerning the funding of experimental work. Now, maybe her brother advised her to send these 2 letters on the same day. He was a civil servant. Maybe he also phrased her letters, but she was the one that took the risk of being fired after posting them. Luckily, she was not fired and her contract was improved a little.
Gunta Stölzl was never an outspoken feminist as we would classify it today, but she was very well aware of her role as a woman and also how exceptional her role at the Bauhaus as a female Jungmeister in Dessau actually was. And what she was doing was, and she also does that in the 1926 article, she really poses weaving at the Bauhaus as mainly a female enterprise. But she also shows that weaving is something that is modern, that fits the larger Bauhaus philosophy of creating for modern living. And she shows that weaving has its place there, that fabrics are not something that are simply a nice decorative addition to our interior, but that fabrics are actually crucial to an interior. We cannot do without curtains or rugs or our furniture fabrics. And she really shows, in a way, in that 1926 article, that women at the Bauhaus were absolutely crucial and also crucial in practicing their craft as weavers. Yeah, the Bauhaus, as far as I know, was financially the most successful workshop. And also when you read reviews from Bauhaus exhibitions, for example, the Bauhaus fabrics were deemed as both revolutionary and as something that modern society needed. I think Gunta Stölzl, and you already see that in her earliest writings, Munich really was grappling with her position as a woman in Germany, in the new Weimar Republic as well later on. She really was someone who was well aware that she as a woman had a different position in society, and she was trying to reconcile that position with a career as an artist and with her wish to serve the community and this wish of serving, offering something to the world. You already see that in her earliest writings, especially in Munich, for example. And I think that was also one of the main reasons why she decided to go to the Bauhaus. This idea that she wanted to play her role in shaping modern society, the new and modern society. And Gunta Stölzl had many friendships at the Bauhaus, but she also had relationships at the Bauhaus. And she would eventually marry Arieh Sharon, who was a student in architecture at the Bauhaus. And she became pregnant before they were properly married, which was, of course, a no-go at the time, and which she was also criticized for. And you really see in her writings, in letters, for example, to her brother. In the beginning, she doesn't want her brother to tell her parents that she is pregnant. She's kind of trying to hide away the fact that she was pregnant before being married. But eventually they married and they got a daughter together, Yael. And then Gunta Stölzl decided to, take 3 months of maternity leave and then simply returned to her position as Jungmeister, which is something that was kind of unheard of at the time, that you would return as a married woman with a child to your job. But she didn't really mind in a way. And in that way, she was very modern, I think. It is said that she would bring sometimes Yael to the workshop with her. Yes, but she would also, I think that she would have someone who would look after Yael. But yeah, there are also a lot of photographs of Yael at the Bauhaus, among other Bauhäusler. But I'm not entirely sure really what she would do when Yael was, at a young age. Yes, even today, if you would bring your newborn baby to work, yes, that's something quite exceptional. She created some major pieces in Dessau. First and foremost, the Prellerhaus Decke, so the throw that was used in the rooms of the Prellerhaus. And it's really a beautiful wooden throw that consists of very beautiful horizontal lines and also vertical lines that when you put it on the beds in the Prater house, it really beautifully integrates within the interior. It's an absolutely stunning throw. And she also created a beautiful wall hanging, a jacquard wall hanging that has been known under the name of Fünf Chöre, which is a name that refers to something technical in how you do jacquard weaving, which is really a very difficult technique. And we are not entirely sure whether this name Fünf Chöre is actually correctly referring to anything technical within the actual wall hanging. It was more of a note that we found on a design, but it's a wall hanging that is absolutely stunning in how it was created. So it was created on a jacquard loom, a loom with a jacquard mechanism on top of it. And that meant that she would have to translate the design into punch cards, which meant that she could technically reproduce the same design over and over again. So that meant that her wall hanging could be reproduced, that her artwork could be reproduced. And that was really something that she experimented with, but which wasn't really much of a success in Dessau. There are not many jacquard weavings left. But this wall hanging, it's now in the St. Annen Museum in Lübeck. It was also rewoven by weaver Katharina Jepsen recently. And it's a design that is beautifully abstract, with geometrical forms, lines, colors. It's a kind of a visual exploration of all the different forms that she could create using a jacquard loom.
The real struggles came for her at Bauhaus Dessau. Not that she talked much about this with me. You know, Gunta was all her life an optimistic, forward-looking person. She didn't much complain about her past. I remember only one piece of information about her Bauhaus past that I have not from her, but from the weaver Trude Arndt. Trude told my mother and me on one of her visits that the technical master in the weaving workshop, Walter Wanke, had been a Nazi, and that he had set up the younger students against my mother. Trude actually visited us to tell her this. Trude had recently heard it directly from the weavers who had started to learn weaving at that time. That was a time when my mother was absent from the Bauhaus. I remember the shock of my mother, and she and Trude Arndt both crying. Neither Trude nor my mother had ever suspected Walter Wanke of setting up students against her. My mother had been away from the Bauhaus when she visited the Rutemas Academy in Moscow. Also, she was away from the Bauhaus around the birth of her daughter Yael. Wanke may have made use of these absences. So this is a piece of information I always felt I should pass on to researchers.
The history of Gunta Stölzl leaving the Bauhaus really is a complicated and also painful one. I have been researching this also for the exhibition in Weimar on the Bauhaus and National Socialism. It mainly started when she went to Moscow with Sharon. She was close with Hans Meyer, who had communist sympathies, who also had to leave the Bauhaus for political reasons. And, well, Gunta Stölzl, being the modern woman that she was, having a child, not being married yet, and then returning to her post after taking several months off for maternity leave. And the situation really got out of hand when she returned. So it seems that there had been accusations behind her back while she was on maternity leave, maybe also sparked by her colleague, Walter Wanke, who would become a member of the Nazi Party in 1933 after he left the Bauhaus. And there were also, in particular, 3 of her younger students, 2 of whom would also join the NSDAP shortly after leaving the Bauhaus. And these were really conservative, kind of right-wing students who were accusing Stölzl of poor leadership, of being a bad teacher, of favoring certain students over other students. It seems that these kind of professional accusations were actually politically motivated and were really meant to kind of get Gunta Stölzl, with her leftist sympathies, with her marriage to a Jewish architect to get her out of the Bauhaus. And these intrigues and these accusations, they lasted months and months. Eventually, she was kind of advised also by Mies van der Rohe, the new director, to leave, because these were tensions, political tensions that were not getting better, that were not changing, and were only getting worse, really, during those months. And Gunta Stölzl was really well aware that these accusations were politically motivated. She also writes about that to friends and family, that she knows that this is not going to get better. She wrote later that she also found a swastika painted on a door, and then she knew, this is something that I'm not going to win. I'm going to resign. So early 1931, she left the Bauhaus and eventually Germany as well. Yes, Grete Reifert was one of the students that really filed a case against Gunta Stölzl. We are not entirely sure why she did so. And Gunta Stölzl also never really wrote about it or had ideas about it. There was Herbert von Arendt, one of the male students, and Ilse Vogt. And Ilse Vogt was also someone who had an important father in politics in Dessau. She could really make a case against her teacher, and that's harrowing to read and to see how Gunta Stölzl was a victim of the political tensions that were creeping into the Bauhaus. And I think that Gunta Stölzl's case really marks how how the Bauhaus was not politically neutral or simply on the right side. It was, the Bauhaus also had students who became party members and had these explicit ideas about it. And Gunta Stölzl really became a victim of it. She had done nothing wrong. She married and had a child. It's really sad that she could not experience the Bauhaus full history. She had all the potential to be a student in Weimar and then all the way a Meister until the very end in Berlin. But that's not what happened, unfortunately. But, we're speaking about the early 1930s, and the situation in Germany is growing worse by the day, both politically and economically. So for both her and Arieh Sharon, it's very difficult to get work, to be together, to be living together as a family, because he is looking for work, she's looking for work. So it's kind of living apart together in a way, and really frantically looking for a future. And eventually Gunta Stölzl decides to go to Zurich, to Switzerland, immigrates with Yael in the autumn of 1931. Arieh Sharon goes to mandatory Palestine to prolong his passport and then doesn't really return. Decides that he wants to stay there, also meets a new woman there, and announces in 1932 that he wants to divorce. So the marriage didn't last long in the end, and it wasn't really the common family life in that sense. She technically lost her German citizenship. So when she moved to Switzerland, she had married Arieh Sharon, which meant that she had the British Palestine passport, which was a kind of complicated passport that she had to renew also every now and then. She constantly had to get new permits to stay and work in Switzerland. But this was a constant concern for her as an immigrant in Switzerland. And then Arieh Sharon announced that he wanted to divorce. Well, that would mean that she could become stateless, declared stateless. Well, also lose her British Palestine passport. Eventually, she managed to prolong her passport shortly before being divorced officially, which meant that she could kind of hang on to her passport. But of course, when the Nazis seized power in 1933, it kind of became impossible for her to even reclaim her German citizenship if she wanted that. So eventually she remarried in 1942 to a Swiss author, Arieh Stadler, and that meant that she finally obtained the Swiss citizenship.
I know that my mother enjoyed her stays in Tel Aviv when Yael had small children. Her travel journal mentions long rides around Galilee, where Sharon and his wife showed her around. There is a photo of Gunta and Arieh in the Red Sea swimming and holding up newspapers and reading them because the salty water makes this possible. I remember my mother burning a huge pile of letters to her from Sharon. I would suppose the relationship had just not been strong enough to survive under the extreme political circumstances. Both wanted to do their work. I asked her once why she did not go to Israel. She answered, "What should I have done there? Sisal carpets were the only thing that I could have woven there." My mother was a socialist at heart. She always wanted to contribute to a group. I read that in her early diaries, in her war diary, and also in the diary of her first year at the Bauhaus. Her closest friends were weavers Trude Arndt and Benita Otte, and Oskar Schlemmer and his wife Tut Schlemmer, Eva and Andor Weininger, Hans Wittwer and Schepers, and Arieh Sharon. After the Bauhaus, she was also in regular contact with other Bauhauslers. Some lived in Switzerland, others came to Switzerland to see her in the summer and spend time with her in the mountains. Andor and Eva Weininger from the US, Lies Österreicher with her husband Otto Biermann, who had both survived concentration camp and afterwards raised the daughters of her sister who had not come back. The weavers Bela Bronner and Benita Otte, the architect Hans Wittwer and his wife Jula, the wife of Oskar Schlemmer, Tut Schlemmer, and the conductor and friend of Oskar Schlemmer, Walter Beck. Benita Otte was her closest friend at Bauhaus Weimar. She didn't come along to Dessau, but switched to the school Burg Giebichenstein in Halle instead, where Benita was fired under the Nazis. I admired her because she led the weaving department of the so-called Bethelschen Anstalten. When I read through the thick pile of Benita's letters after Mama's death, I never understood why she disliked and feared some Bobby in her institution. I thought it was a nasty superior. Only much later I learned that she wrote Bobby instead of Adolf Hitler. She could not write Hitler, of course. Such a mistake could have been fatal for Benita and for the inmates of the Bethelsche Anstalten. I sometimes think that both Benita and my mother would have been luckier if they had emigrated to the United States, where Bauhauslers got good jobs and were hailed as heroes of modernism. But compared to Benita, Gunta counted herself lucky to be in Switzerland.
I think that Gunta Stölzl's first years in Switzerland were really harsh and really difficult because she was on her own and because she had this status as an immigrant. When she came to Zurich in 1931, she had to fix things like a work permit. She had to find accommodation for her and her daughter. She had some friends already in Switzerland, so she knew the artist Berta Tapolet from her years in Munich. They had studied together. And she could live with this family in Zurich and also drop off Yael when she would go to work. When she came to Zurich, she already had the plan to set up a hand-weaving workshop with two former Bauhaus students. So the first one was Gertrud Preiswerk. And Gertrud Preiswerk had been her student in Dessau. And when Gunta Stölzl was accused by her three students, Gertrud Preiswerk was really one of the students that kind of stood up for her, that tried to defend Gunta Stölzl. And Gertrud Preiswerk came from quite a rich family in Basel, so she was the one who could also finance this new business. The other person that she and Preiswerk joined was Heinrich Otto Hürlimann, and Hürlimann had been a short-term student in Weimar and had also been in Herliberg together with Gunta Stölzl and Johannes Itten. He had been a professional handweaver already for several years in Zurich, and he had been leading the department of weaving at the Kunstgewerbeschule in Zurich. So Hürlimann really was, in a sense, connected in Zurich, knew the weaving world quite well, and Gertrud Preiswerk was a Dessau student who could also finance this new enterprise. And they were called SBH Stoffe, So just their first initials. And they worked together until 1933 in Zurich, and they created functional fabrics for the interior. So really, in a way, not autonomous artworks, but really functional fabrics. And they did so, for example, Wohnbedarf, a company in Zurich that also had, for example, Marcel Breuer as one of its designers. Max Bill, also a Bauhausler, joined Wohnbedarf. And they were kind of the textile designers for Wohnbedarf until 1933. In 1933, Wohnbedarf kind of cancelled a big commission for SPH Stoffe, and that also meant the financial end of the company. So SPH Stoffe dissolved, in the sense that Gertrud Preiswerk left the company and Heinrich Otto Hüllimann and Gunta Stölzl continued together until late 1937 as S&H Stoffe. And S&H Stoffe was relatively successful, would also create functional fabrics for the interior, also had some commissions or collaborations with industry in Switzerland, but not much. And they would also create fashion fabrics, which for Gunta Stölzl was kind of a new market to tap into. It was not really something that they had been doing at the Bauhaus a lot, fashion fabrics. But Hüllimann had, and they kind of tapped into that new market. And then in 1938, Heinrich Otto Hüllimann left the company as well. And I'm still not entirely sure why. But he continued as a teacher at the Kunstgewerbeschule and also had his own private hand-weaving workshop somewhere else in Switzerland. And Gunta Stölzl had to, continue on her own. And as she had not married Willi Stadler at the time, she was still kind of an immigrant in Switzerland, but she had been building, of course, throughout the 1930s, a network of like-minded architects, designers that she could collaborate with. And one of those people was Elsa Burkhardt, who was a female architect, one of the first really professional independent architects in Switzerland. And Elsa Burkhardt was the one who kind of provided Gunta Stölzl the necessary money and also the necessary files to continue on her own as an immigrant. And she did so as Handweberei Flora, named after the Florastrasse in central Zurich, where this hand-weaving workshop was located. And Handweberei Flora existed until 1968, when Gunta Stölzl finally retired after a long career of professional hand-weaving in Switzerland. And she would always create functional fabrics for the interior on a hand loom, as she had done at the Bauhaus in Weimar and in Dessau. And what also continues throughout her career is the fact that she was the one leading the workshop. So she was not just a weaver and a very talented designer with a lot of experience, but she also knew how to manage her own business. She was really a businesswoman leading a company. She had several employees, roughly 5 employees at any given time, who would work for her, who would also carry out her designs on the looms. And she was really the one who would do the networking, who would get the commissions. And she did so quite successfully. With the fact that she had her own hand-weaving workshop until she retired in the late 1960s is a huge feat, I would say. What is also interesting is that she would collaborate with famous architects in Switzerland. For example, with Hans Fischli, who had been a student in Dessau, a Swiss Bauhausler who returned to Switzerland and set up his own architecture office. He and Gunta Stölzl collaborated several times. And in my research, I'm kind of trying to research that and get that out, because it's really interesting to see how Hans Fischli commissioned Gunta Stölzl on several big occasions for particularly spanning fabrics that often contained cellophane, a material that the Bauhaus weavers in Dessau in particular experimented with a lot. Spanning fabrics that were very properly washable, but also would reflect the light very nicely, for example. So that was really a very important commissioner for her throughout her years in Switzerland, and in particular in those difficult early years.
Switzerland was entirely different. In her letters, she praises the cooperation with her two colleagues, Heinrich Otto Hürlimann and Gertrud Preiswerk, both Bauhaus weavers, and the absence of discussions about policy questions. Now, she and her colleagues worked on commissions for functional fabrics. She complained to friends that there was no time for creating wall hangings. Mirjam Deckers just found out that there was also a jacquard loom in the workshop, but we know of no jacquard fabrics from the Zurich period. I guess they were too busy earning money through commissions. After she had closed down the hand mill, she could devote herself again to wall hangings and was finally successful with these when she was over 70. Some of them can be seen in the exhibition in Thun. They have all been photographed professionally now, and they haven't suffered much through all those decades. They met in a club of German emigres. My father had studied in Freiburg in Germany. He was a writer and journalist. He was in contact with German immigrants who had fled Nazi Germany, writers, journalists, actors, and artists. My mother went to the same club. She told a story of one of those meetings when they were surprised to discover that they had all started to speak Swiss German. The reason? Germany had started the Second World War. The Swiss felt threatened by Germany. So they all felt that to speak High German would be offensive to the Swiss. My mother even took lessons in Swiss German. But back to my parents. Together they were able to buy a little house in Küsnacht, a modern flat-roofed house built by the architects Elsa and Ernst Burkhardt. Above all, I enjoy following the development and research of Mirjam Deckers, which is well received and has resulted in several important publications, among which are the catalogue for the exhibition of Kunstmuseum Thun in Switzerland about Stölzl's textile work and that of Johannes Itten. We did not talk enough. I did ask her to see her designs though, and remember we did this several times and we both enjoyed it. I remember her talking about the reception of the Bauhaus by art historians, and she was critical. The work of the weavers were not appreciated enough by Bauhaus art historians, she said. I have fine memories of our drawing, painting and printing together. But above all, I like to think about our outdoor experiences. Swimming in mountain lakes, mountain climbing with her and with Yael and with Yael's boys, later with me and my girls. She was so happy walking, enjoying everything she saw. Landscapes, cattle, mountain farmers, medieval churches and chapels, the beautiful old farmhouses in the village of Amnen above the Walensee. I like to think of nightly walks from our house in the mountain village of Amnen. On clear nights, we saw the lovely landscape of Amnen under the millions of stars above, a breathtaking experience. We walked in the light of stars and took in a landscape that was out of this world.
Ooh, well, there is a lot, of course, that is, for me, quite inspiring, but there is a quote from Gunta Stölzl, and I think it's from a letter that she wrote to her then almost new husband, Arieh Stadler. I'm not able to reproduce it entirely, but it runs something like, if you do not expect anything from anyone, you are able to see very beautiful things. It's kind of characterizing for her how she lived her life, particularly in Switzerland. She really was someone who, well, never really expected a lot, was also never really disappointed in life. And I think that when you look at her life and her biography, she had all the reasons to be disappointed or to get bitter about life. And what I find very inspiring when you look at her life and her writings and her work is that she would always simply continue to work hard, to provide for her family, but also that she saw the beauty in things. And you see that in her drawings from her earliest years, and you see it in the love that she put into all of her fabrics, and also in her later wall hangings. You see this fascination for ordinary life, and she was not really expecting anything from it.
The archive of Gunta Stölzl's Swiss business, Handweberei Flora, is in its state for itself. Monika and Mirjam, our two interview partners for today's episode, have gathered the textiles and the knowledge and published with Ariel Aloni, Gunta Stölzl's and Arieh Sharon's grandson, the Gunta Stölzl Digital Archive, guntastölzl.org, the twin website for the Arieh Sharon Digital Archive that Ariel and I talked in the previous episode about. I will link them both for you in the show notes. Here you will find a detailed biography, family photos, publications, rereads, and previous exhibitions. Monika and Mirjam mentioned two exhibitions that are currently running. The first one is Bauhaus and National Socialism that is still on until 15th of September and is divided into three parts at three different museums in Weimar: the Museum Neues Weimar, the Bauhaus Museum Weimar, and the Schiller Museum. Mirjam has published a piece about Gunta Stölzl's resignation from the Bauhaus in the catalogue. The second exhibition is called Gunta Stölzl and Johannes Itten, Textile Universes at the Kunstmuseum Thun in Switzerland. It will open on 17th of August and will be open until 1st of December. Of course, you can find the exhibition links in the show notes too. The majority of Gunta Stölzl's work from the Bauhaus is at the Bauhaus Archive Berlin, the Museum of Modern Art New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Harvard Art Museums in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation, the Neue Pinakothek in Munich, the Museum für Gestaltung in Zurich, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the MKNG Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe in Hamburg, and the Kunstsammlung in Chemnitz. Again, all the links in the show notes. If you're now curious to get to know more about Gunta Stölzl, I highly recommend the biography Gunta Stölzl, Pionierin der Bauhausweberei, Pioneer of the Bauhaus Weaving Workshop by Ingrid Radewald. Ingrid's research about Gunta Stölzl spans over decades now, and she has published numerous books and articles about Gunta Stölzl, and I promise that I will try and produce an episode with her too. Thank you so much, Monika and Mirjam, for your time, your willingness to participate in my little project, and for sharing all of the knowledge and memories with us. You made this episode. One last humble plea to all the listeners. Don't forget to rate Bauhaus Faces on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you are listening, and recommend it to fellow Bauhaus fans and researchers. Maybe also join me on Instagram at Bauhaus Faces and on my website bauhausfaces.com. And now there's nothing left to say but tune in to the next episode of Bauhaus Faces.